Hi, this is a video tutorial on the counteroffer. Now by now you've probably watched the video on how to write an offer and you know everything about the purchase contract by now. What the counteroffer is, and it looks a little bit like its own contract, which it technically is, but it's made part of the purchase contract. The purchase contract throughout the entire transaction will stay in play, but the counteroffer is just the document that is going to supersede what's already written in the purchase contract. So let's say we only counter the price, then everything else in the purchase contract stands except for the price. When you do a counter offer, whatever you're doing in here will actually supersede whatever is written in the purchase contract. It doesn't take place of the purchase contract. It just is a document that you fill out to tell the other party what you are changing in regard to the purchase contract. The purchase contract will always stay in play throughout the entire transaction. Okay, so now we're going to fill out our counteroffer. So starting with the top of the page here on page 1, we've got something similar to filling out the purchase contract, which is the reviewed by form. So if you're representing a seller and you are countering the buyer, let's say the buyer has presented you with an offer and now your seller wants to counter some things within that contract, you're going to, as a seller agent, fill out the counter offer. Now, if you are representing a buyer and you have presented your offer, the seller has come back to you with their counter and now you're countering that counter, you would also do the same thing with the counter. Every time you do a counter, you're pretty much Xing out the counter before. So, as I mentioned, the counter offer that you're doing is going to supersede all that's in the purchase contract. So it will get a little confusing if you're countering back and forth, but I'll try to explain that later as we get deeper into this. Okay, we're going to start off by filling out the reviewed by section, which is just like the purchase contract. So we're going to put in Karen Mayer because she's going to be reviewing our contract, and brokerage firm Elite Pacific Properties. Counter offer date. This would be the date of your counter. Same as the purchase contract reference date, this is going to be the counteroffer reference date. The reason why we have these dates is if ever you have to reference something in an email or go back to a specific document, you can say things like the counteroffer reference date April 18th, purchase contract dated March 15th. That way it's easy to understand what you're talking about. So we've got a counteroffer reference date and submitted by buyer or seller. So whoever you are doing the counter for, you would check off the appropriate box. So if you are a seller agent and you received an offer that you're countering, you would check off seller. And then if you are a buyer countering back on a seller counter, then you would check off buyer. Purchase contract reference date, then this is where you would go to your purchase contract and see whatever the date is from the contract that you received, and then you would plug that date in this line. So let's just say, for example, it was March 30th. That's weird why that happened. And then we come down to seller's name. So you would just put in seller name and then the buyer name. And so you might get stuck here as the first thing getting stuck on doing a counter. This is where you would go back to your purchase contract and you would go to page 12. Okay, we skipped to page 12 here. So page 12 of the purchase contract, you see here where it says buyer name. You want to make sure that you put the same name as it appears here because this is probably how they're going to want to take title, but it needs to be consistent throughout the purchase contract. So get their name, then you would go back to your contract, plug in the name of the buyer. So I think Barry Buyer. Okay, and then of course the property reference, you would put the property address in here, put the TMK number here, and so on. Okay, now we're going to scroll down to where it says fill in all checked boxes. So the first section here is section A. So if you go back to your purchase contract, section A, Section A A1 agency and A2 disclosure. Sometimes it does happen where the buyer filling out the contract may put in the wrong information, like maybe check off the wrong box here. But anyway, this entire section A2 can be countered, and how you would do that is you would check off the box agency disclosure, and let's say they messed up or something on the name of the agency. You could say maybe they checked the wrong box for is a member of the National Association of Realtors. You would say is a member of the National Association of Realtors or whatever, because like that's what I was trying to explain to you over here. A2, if they check off the wrong box, you can't just leave it. You're going to have to clean it up and fix it. And sometimes people will do that, but you have to clean it up in a counteroffer. Same thing for buyer representation. Sometimes people make mistakes there. Again, too, if maybe they're doing a boilerplate offer, like maybe they've written several offers and they accidentally put the old company, you want to clean it up here. So if they put the other company, like let's say it was Coldwell Banker that their other offer was written on, and they accidentally left Coldwell Banker here, you'll want to make sure that you clean it up by saying seller represented by Elite Pacific. Oopsies. Pacific Properties. And also notice that there are letters here. So if you're going to counter one of these, make sure you include the letter. So if this was a mistake and I'm going to change this to I'm representing the seller, I work for Elite Pacific Properties, then I'm going to need to do A2A. So that's when you would go here and put A2A. Seller represented by Elite Pacific Properties. That's like if you're needing to clean up anything that maybe was a mistake that was written. Okay, the next section here talks about initial earnest money deposit, which is that initial deposit. So let's say they're only doing $1,000 and you want to increase it to $5,000. Unfortunately, you can still put it down here, but if you're going to be doing anything with the initial deposit, it has its own specific line here to counter. So if you're going to change that, you could check in the box, and then you're going to come over here and you're going to say change it to maybe $10,000, whatever you decide to do. There's also another section here that talks about how the deposit's going to be done. So let's say instead of it being an uncashed check, somehow you've heard after the offer came through, or maybe you would rather it be wired funds or something like that, you could always change the initial deposit to say wired funds to be deposited within 5 business days or something like that. But you can also counter that portion of the B section. So going back to the B section, you've got all of these things that can be countered. Obviously, we're not going to be countering this stuff here, but these things could be countered actually. Okay, and so now we go down to the addenda. So you'll notice here there's a section for addenda. Now, if you're wondering what do I put if I'm not countering any of this stuff, you would just simply leave it blank, obviously, because you're not countering anything, but you would want to put in here no change. This way it's understood that you're not changing anything there. If you leave it blank, it's a little ambiguous. You don't want to like leave that open. So put NC for no change, and then just leave the section blank. Only check it and put something in there if you're going to actually be countering something. Okay, and so we're going to counter the addenda, and let's say we want to add in an as is addendum. What you want to do is put add as is addendum, and then let's say you were working with the seller and the buyer has given you an offer and they have their Coldwell Banker addendum, or they have their own standard addendum for the company, and you do not like the terms, or maybe your client doesn't like the terms of their addendum, you can delete the addendum also. So you would say delete, and whatever addendum was attached to the purchase contract, you can delete it here by saying delete Coldwell Banker Pacific Properties Standard Addendum. Okay, so if you're adding an addendum, you would add it. If you're deleting an addendum, you would delete it. And all of that would take place in this section here. So all addendums would be taken care of here, even if you were going to be adding something. Okay, so now we go down to the purchase price, which is probably the area that you're mostly going to see being countered. You would put a check in the box because this just makes them understand that it's applicable, that you're countering that section. And if you are changing anything to do with the initial deposit, like we did up here with the 10,000, you would bring it down here again because you want to make sure that this is a rewrite of the purchase price. So although the purchase contract stays in play, anything that you write here is going to supersede what's in the contract. But even though you may not be technically countering deposits and things, and you're only really going to be changing the price, you'll still need to sort of rewrite it here just so that it's understood and that there's no mistake here. If you're changing the additional deposit, you would just put in the amount that you're changing. If you've received an offer and they have put in here to be delivered upon acceptance of the J1 or something like that, and you want to change it, you can change it here. So again, whatever you write in here is going to supersede what's on the contract. So if we go back to that, I'll show you. In an original contract, they're going to have this section here when that deposit is to be done. So if you are a seller and you are not happy with let's delete that, sorry. If you are not happy with when they're going to be doing the deposit, you may want to change this. If you don't want to wait 3 business days from acceptance of J1 and you want it a little sooner, then you would need to counter it. If the $10,000 deposit was not enough, you want to make it higher, again, you would need to put it here on the contract, on the counteroffer. So let's say you want to change it from 3 business days to maybe 1 business day. Acceptance J1, and then you would just add up all your dollars to make sure that it does equate to the new purchase price. I think I maybe made that too much. Okay, so anyway, maybe made that too many zeros there. If the mortgage is going to be coming from a, like, let's see, if it's a VA loan or something like that, and maybe they're putting specific terms in here that your seller is not happy with. Like, let's say they only want to do a certain percentage or something like that. We have a percentage interest rate. You might want to change the specifics of that paragraph and just say, a first mortgage at prevailing rates. You might see it say a first mortgage at prevailing rates in terms acceptable to buyer. If you have that acceptable to buyer thing in there, then if for whatever reason the buyer is not happy with his loan, he can cancel. If you take that out of it and he's qualified to get a loan, he shouldn't really be able to cancel. That's still sort of kind of a gray area too, but at least you're taking out that out for a buyer. They'd still be able to get out anyway if they didn't get the loan for whatever reason. And so some people like to take that out when they're doing a counter offer. It's sort of a surprise sometimes, so you might want to be careful of that. Okay, and then again, if you want to go ahead and date it, now is good because, like I maybe mentioned in another video, that when you're doing things through DocuSign, it's kind of cumbersome having to click and drag the date over everything. So that's easy to do. Why don't you do it here? Okay, now page 2 is countering everything else in the purchase contract. So as we did up here, it has a section all the way up to, it has sections all the way up to the purchase contract, but nothing else. So if you go back to your purchase contract and you see D2 here, once you get to E, there are no other sections in the counteroffer to counter. So you will have to number each one appropriately. So if you read here, it says the following sections of the purchase contract, E to S, and or terms and conditions of any addenda are amended as follows. So you'll check this box, and then whatever you need to counter within the contract, you would have to number the paragraph. So if you're going to do any countering of anything here, you'll need to number it E2. If you're going to counter the inventory list, you're going to have to number it E3, and etc. So let's say, just for example, we were going to counter E2 inclusions. We would put E2 and a little colon there. And then what are we going to be countering? Let's say there's no air conditioning. You could put delete air conditioner. And let's say, for example, you were going to add chandelier, like that. And then maybe there's something else you want to add, like barbecue, things like that. So this is how you would do that. Let's say you were going to change the closing date. Let's say the closing date was, you want to make a change to the closing date. You would go down to the F section, schedule closing date, F2. Instead of 45 days, maybe your seller needs 60 days for whatever reason. Okay, so F2, we're going to put 60 days. And whatever you put here, this is going to change the numbers on the line. So you don't have to write out the entire thing, schedule closing date, yada yada. You can just put in whatever's on the line. It is understood that whatever's on the line is getting changed when you come here. So whatever's written on this line changes what's written on the line on the purchase contract. Okay, so now let's say, for example, you are going to do some more countering. Let's say you're going to counter the escrow company. You would just simply put F4, and then you would change the name of the escrow company and whoever the escrow officer's name is. Let's see, another good one that gets countered a lot is, let's see, by now you understand how things are with regard to the paragraph. So let's say that you're doing a financing change and you're not happy with the formula that's written by the buyer's agent. So let's say you have, just as an example, let's say this says within 10 days of acceptance. That's a really long time to apply for the loan. I would counter that. Let's say the pre-qual was not attached and they said that they were going to give you a pre-qual within 5 or 10 days, something like that. And let's say that this time frame was just way too close to the closing. You're going to want to change some of this stuff. So there are several different boxes here that you're going to want to change. So remember how you got the actual number of the paragraph, and then you have the letters here, but we're going to make changes to just a couple. So we don't like A, we don't like B, this one's fine, that sort of thing. So we're just going to go here, back to our counter, oops, sorry, and then we're going to put in H4, and then we're going to go A, and then you're going to put whatever that is. So let's say instead of 10 days, you're going to put within 2 days of acceptance. So you just change the counter from 5 days or whatever, 10 days to 2 days. So now when this buyer gets the counter, he's going to have to go, am I going to be able to make it in 2 days? So got to be careful too when you're countering back, what's the story with the buyer. You don't want to like trip him up too. So you got to think about things when you're doing your counter. But 10 days is an awfully long time to apply for a loan. So let's say you're going to go ahead and put that in. And now you're going to go H4B, which is the pre-qual, and that's going to be done within 1 day of acceptance, because that shouldn't take too long to get. And then if you wanted to counter H4, C, and D, and so on, but that's how you would do it. Now let's say you get all the way to the end of the contract and you're at the Q section, and in the buyer's contract, they have written in the Q section something special. I'm not sure if we have it in our sample here, but I'll check. But let's say they have something written in their Q section. Yeah, I've got it here. Q1, buyer and seller agree that this sale is being sold furnished. Okay, well that doesn't apply in this situation. But let's say they don't want to pay for cleaning. So, your seller does not want to have to pay for cleaning. They have written in their contract, should seller not have the cleaning done by the final walkthrough, seller agrees to credit buyer. Let's say the number was, $1,000 at closing. But the seller goes, you know what, that's not going to be $1,000 to do. I will not pay $1,000. So now you want to counter this Q section here. So now what you need to do is go to your counter, and put in Q2 and either delete, or you could maybe do something like change 1,000 to 500 or something, so that you're agreeing to something but you're not going to pay that much. Whatever you do here is going to supersede the purchase contract. Now let's say you want to, we'll go ahead and put this in here, we'll just put deleted. So now you're deleting Q2, but now you want to add a Q. Let's say, for example, you want to add something to the purchase contract that wasn't already there, and you've already got a Q1 and a Q2. Now you're going to go with Q3. Now this can get confusing because we deleted Q2. Should we replace Q2 with this new thing? We like to keep it nice and clean, so although Q2 is being deleted, it was still on the purchase contract. So although we're deleting it, it's still there. So we want to just make a brand new Q, which is Q3. We already have a Q1 and a Q2. Now we're making a Q3. So whatever you're going to do with your Q3, let's say you're going to provide plans. Seller will provide set of building plans, or whatever it is that you're gonna counter. Maybe you might want to say something that you want the buyer to do. I don't know, whatever it is. If you're going to add another Q, you're going to number it this way. Okay, so that is all the way to the Q. Now let's say, and it has happened before, where there are mistakes made on the last page of the contract, or even R6 to disclosure. Sometimes they may forget to check it, but you may have to add it in. You would just simply put in R6 like everything else, and then put in the name of the person who holds the license. Okay, now going to the last page of the contract. If you're doing a counter, it's very important that when you are setting this up to send to your client for signature, that you check off the counter offer box. Very important that you do that. So that, if you get anything out of this video, that's a big thing right there, is to check off the counter offer. Now, if for some reason this is a mistake made in here, let's say they put the wrong brokerage company, you would just simply put in T3 like everything else, and then put in the correct name of the brokerage company. And that would be probably the last thing with regard to the purchase contract. Now let's say, for example, they had their standard addendum and you didn't like what was in the standard addendum. You could actually delete certain sections of their addendum. So let's say, for example, you've got a Prudential, I'll do Coldwell Banker, Pacific Properties standard addendum. Okay, you would just, whatever item number it was, I don't have it right in front of me, but it lists all the numbers. It'll go number 1 this, number 1 that. So whatever item number it is, you would number it by item number. So let's just say, for example, item number 2 has to do with the termite inspection. Sometimes you might want to delete that, because if you're representing a seller and their addendum says that the buyer can cancel for whatever reason once they receive the termite report, you might want to delete that section out. And a lot of times I just go delete in its entirety, because that paragraph can be pretty long. However, you could just delete certain words if you want to, or a certain sentence, but just to be clean, if it has anything to do with the termite inspection, obviously the buyer should understand that if there are termites found, that the seller has to tent. But to give that buyer a right to cancel just because they received the termite inspection report is just crazy. So we always like to kind of like just delete that whole thing out. But it is in a lot of the other company standard addendums. And there might be something else that you don't like. Maybe there was something in the standard addendum, like let's say it was item number 4, that they want you as a seller to buy a professional building permit package, but you don't want to do that. You don't want to pay the money or whatever. You're just not happy with having to do that. Then you can delete it here. You could say delete in its entirety as well. Or you can say, or even at this point, you can say deleted, right? And then you could put add let's say, for example, you already have the building permit package, you could say seller shall deliver professional building permit package to buyer within 3 days of acceptance for buyer review and approval during the J1 period. Something like that. The reason why I mentioned this is because in some of these standard addendums, they say that the seller needs to order and pay for a building permit package. So if you already had one, you wouldn't obviously want to order a whole brand new one. You would just give them what you had. So by deleting it, you're deleting their paragraph, but you're adding your own paragraph here. Okay? Now, another thing I like to put in a counter if you're going back and forth and maybe some deadlines have passed or whatever in between this, then I like to put in a standard term, which is you can make another Q here by saying, you can go in here like number Q4, we would number another Q, and it's actually a standard clause that I have in our clause editor, is the continuation of the contract. So we'll say here, I don't like it when it does that. Sorry. Come on, work with me here. There we go. So continuation of PC. The buyer and seller agree that this counteroffer is a continuation of the purchase contract dated, and then you would just insert that language, and then you would put in the purchase contract reference date, so whatever the date that is, okay? But you see what I'm saying? Buyer and seller agree that this counteroffer is a continuation of the purchase contract. Sometimes when the purchase contract has gone over and the counteroffer has it's taken a long time for the seller to respond, you might want to just tie it up here with that is a continuation. It just kind of keeps it all nice and clean. So that's pretty much how to fill out this section. Now we're going to go down to the expiration date of the expiration of the counteroffer. So this would be the time frame for the buyer to accept the counter or whatnot. So the counteroffer will expire at, you would put in a specific time frame, say 5 p.m. and we usually like to give same kind of situation with regard to countering as when you're doing a purchase contract. You want to give the other party some time to respond. Now, a lot of times people put a lot of weight on the response time on a purchase contract. So let's say the purchase contract has gone out and let's say the deadline is already passed and now we're doing a counter. If you are a seller and you've received a purchase contract and you want to accept that purchase contract, you need to do it within the response period on that purchase contract. If you're countering, or if you know you're going to counter, you don't need to worry so much about that deadline because you're already going to be countering that purchase contract. You're basically, that deadline is null and void once you do a counter. So there's no pressure to get your counter out within that period because that period was only set for the acceptance of that purchase contract. If you're not accepting it, you're basically rejecting it. So the counteroffer has its own set of rules regarding another response period. So that's what this is. This is giving the buyer the time now to review and accept the offer. So the buyer would then have until April 20th at 5 o'clock to accept this offer. And again, if they decide they're not going to accept this counter, they don't have to rush to get an acceptance here. The reason for this time is that if another thing to think about as well is that while this counter offer is out and the buyer is pondering whether they want to accept it, you could reject it at any time. Same thing as a purchase contract. So the time frame for someone to respond, if the buyer wanted to pull out and say, "Oops, I don't want to buy this house anymore. Sorry, I'm gonna retract my offer," they can do that at any time prior to the deadline if it hasn't already been accepted. The same thing applies with the counter offer. If you have a counter offer out, and let's say that buyer has not accepted the counter, then you could theoretically retract the counter, and you'd have to do it in writing, of course, but you could do that. So it's kind of incumbent on the buyer to hurry up and accept it so that you don't go off accepting any other offers. But you would have to formally reject the offer before accepting anything else, but you literally could do that. So that's why the time frame is really important. But again, the counter offer, when you are doing a counter, it opens up a brand new response period. Okay, so I think I pretty much cleared that part up. Let's talk about this next section here, which is the signature boxes. So once you're doing a counter, whoever you're representing, seller or buyer, you're going to check off the appropriate box, and this is where that party would sign. So let's say you're representing seller. Seller would sign and date here. So seller, 1 or 2, and then you would put in today's date, because this would be the date of the counter. And it's up to you whether or not you want to fill this out. Some people do it, some people don't. And then you could put in the titles of the people here. That's what that's there for. But let's say you're sending this over to a buyer. If the buyer is going to accept this counter, then they are going to fill out the acceptance date. They're going to put in the acceptance date and sign. And then it would become a binding contract. Counter would go on top of the purchase contract, and then you would have a counter and a purchase contract, and that would be a fully executed contract. Okay, and I pretty much think that's it for this counter offer. I'm just thinking real quick here if there's anything to mention. If you are going to be a buyer countering a seller counter, it's important for you to, let's talk about that real quick, because that is sort of important. Let's say you receive this counter right here. You are a buyer and the seller has countered you on these items, okay? And let's say you're going to counter back and you only want to agree with a couple of these things. Then when you do your counter offer, obviously, let's say a buyer is doing a countering of a counter, you are going to, of course, change all this information to be a buyer, and then it would be all the information pertaining to a buyer. And then if you are agreeable to the counter offer, let's say this was in front of you as a seller counter, and you were agreeable to this, then because you're redoing a counter, you can't use their counter because you don't have access to it. You would be doing a brand new counter. You would have to copy and paste or basically just rewrite what's on the counter from the seller counter offer and just re-add it in here. So if you were okay with the as is, you would say add as is addendum. And let's say you were not okay with deleting your Coldwell Banker. Let's say your company says, yes, you must put that. You would delete that out, and then it would just be add the as is. But you got to think about, what did the seller counter you, and are you okay with some of their items? You may want to keep them in. You're going to have to rewrite them into your counter. And so let's say you're changing price and whatever, and on page 2 you were okay with obviously this because they don't have an air conditioner, and you're okay with them adding these things. But let's say you're not happy with the closing, and let's say you're okay with maybe instead of a 45-day, you're okay with maybe a 50-day. I don't know, just putting it out there. You're gonna put this 50 days, and why is that not typing in? I don't know why. That's really strange. I don't know. That's really weird. Something happened. But anyway, let's say you wanted to change that. Just go ahead and, make the change. And then let's say you were not happy with any of these dates, then you can just delete them out. Only put in what you're willing to keep and what you're going to be countering yourself. So let's say you were not happy with what they took out of your Coldwell Banker addendum. You take out that termite thing, maybe that was important to you. So I hope you understand what I'm saying with regard to, if you are a buyer and you have received a seller counter, maybe there are some things in the seller's counter that were okay with your buyer. And I would just remind you to make sure that you put those back into your counter, because you're going to be doing a brand new counter, and that will supersede that other counter. In fact, that other counter that the seller did no longer exists. It's null and void. Cross it out, put it to the side. You're not even going to be you're not even going to be going back to it again. It's done. So, and if the seller is not happy with your counter, they could start all over again with their counter, and it could go back and forth. So anyway, so I think that that's pretty much concludes the counter offer. And again, thank you. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to call Leanna Berwick. Thank you.